Welcome to 30 Minutes of Faith. We're happy to have Minister Monique Tarver with us today. She has been with us on other occasions, and this will be a fun conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm always glad when you and I can get together.
Absolutely.
Tell our audience more about what you do specifically these days.
Absolutely. I am a trainer looking to build on the conversation and dialogue between the mental health community and the faith and spiritual community. What we've learned in mental health is that there are a lot of individuals who are in mental wellness recovery, and they utilize their faith and spiritual practices as wellness tools as they're working through their recovery journey. I am the chair of the Mental Health and Spirituality Initiative. It's a statewide initiative housed with California Institute for Mental Health, based right here in Sacramento County. And we look at the initiative from the initiative standpoint. We're looking at the role of churches and faith communities in mental health, wellness, and recovery, and also working with the mental health community to integrate spirituality and faith and wellness practices and in the toolkits of individuals who are receiving services in the mental health system.
Now, you and I have talked before about if we gather people together, nearly everybody in the room knows someone who is affected with mental health struggles one way or the other. Does coming to God help repair and fix that?
The interesting thing is that what we've learned is that overwhelmingly faith communities and pastors, deacons, ministers, any leader in the faith community really remain a first choice for many individuals living with mental health diagnoses. That's either before a diagnosis has been rendered, just at the realization of symptoms, and then after a diagnosis to help in that continued support. Recovery from mental health is very possible. People thrive in wellness and recovery, and although we sort of look at it like maybe people turn to the faith community as a last resort, we're really seeing that people are already there. And they're looking to clergy and the faith community for that interconnectedness and that community support. And it really is a part of individuals' cultural practices.
Quite a few years ago, I served as a chaplain at a hospital in another city and would get called frequently, can I come up? One night I went up and there was a young adult man, and he had worked his way up on the table and he was trying to stick himself to the wall. And I went in and sat down and introduced myself, and I said, I was told that you wanted someone to speak with. And he said to me, "Are you God?" And I said, "I'm not, but I'm a minister from a church." "Well, can you speak for God?" I said, "Well, I'll try. I can't promise you anything." "Well, but I've got some things to tell God, and somebody needs to tell him because he's not listening to me." Well, I went back, saw him every day for a week or 10 days, and in the meantime, he was getting professional help and all those other things. I've thought about him 1,000 times because I think he just needed to be recognized, validated, verified, and understand in his own heart that he was of some worth and a child of God, sort of thing. And all the other issues, and there were many, and he didn't just get it resolved in a couple of weeks, but they all sort of centered there. I'd like to stop for a second. Do you have children?
I do.
Can you tell us about them?
I most certainly can. It's one of my favorite subjects. I have a wonderful, wonderful husband, and we've been married almost 16 years. We're looking forward to our sweet 16. We have 3 wonderful children together, our son Elijah, Joshua, and Imani. Imani is my baby girl, the one that I have prayed for. In fact, her name means, by faith, I prayed for a little girl, and she's here. Her name is Imani Abeni. 2 of our children do live with mental health diagnoses, and we've come to learn what it means to support individuals through that process, and by building on faith, not just as individuals who have the diagnosis, but also as those of us who are family members who consider ourselves caring for those individuals. And that's something that you talked about earlier, just in terms of when you get individuals in the room and you ask who's being affected by mental health challenges and concerns, almost everybody can relate to that, because there are so many individuals in our nation who live with mental health diagnoses, and then so many people who are affected as their family members. And so I think, even what you were talking about, just going back to the gentleman that you visited in the hospital, you sort of summed up several of the projects that I'm involved in that look at how we partner in the faith community and in the mental health community to build and create a welcoming environment for which people can thrive holistically.
What brought you to the work?
My own lived experience with mental health diagnoses. I went to, like most people, I turned to family first, turned to faith community first, which for a lot of us, our family and our faith communities are so interconnected, because when you really ask people to self-identify, which is the idea around recovery being most impactful for people, when you ask people to identify their culture, family, and faith, it's really a part of that. It's a huge part of that, particularly for me, and I'm not alone in that. And I sat down with the mental health community and said, listen, you need to know about me that I have a God, and I believe that if he doesn't heal me, I won't be healed. To which that was not listened to, that was not heard. In fact, it was dismissed away as part of my illness. And then
that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a long history there. And so then I experienced the flip side of that, which was going to my faith community and my family and hearing, no, we don't get that. And so those created a lot of barriers to care, and it helped me to see that I really needed both communities to work together. And as a parent, you always want better for your children. And so that through that difficult time, I was able to realize my own assignment in God, which was to ensure that my children or anyone who can resonate with our experience would not have that same difficulty in getting the most important parts of their worlds to come together so that they can be the best them.
One of the ironies in the interfaith work, I go to meetings every week, and a wide variety and a wide range, where mostly we see the familiar and positive things, and people aren't dwelling too much on the bad things. But one of the ironies is that everybody thinks they are a child of God, and it doesn't matter if they see God as a man or a woman or something. They all believe they're a child of God, and they all say that, and they all state that, and they're passionate about it. But then they say, but don't make me get along with my sister over there or my brother over there. And it's just an interesting irony. And part of it sort of comes from where they are mentally. And I don't mean, strange, but just how they've been raised, what they've been taught, what their behavior patterns are. And the mental view marches, there they are sitting in church, and it marches right down the aisle with their spirituality. Very, very interesting.
Absolutely. I think all of our worldview is always, it always builds upon so many different factors and so many different aspects of our lives. But you do see that central theme there that when we define spirituality from the initiative standpoint, we talk about it being a person's deepest sense of belonging or connection to a higher power outside of themselves and or a life philosophy. So it's really those core values that really resonate with a person and allow them to see things the way that they do and the way they relate and interact with the world. And one of the reasons why we do this work in mental health is because we understand that the view of spirituality, like the gentleman that you met, are you God? Can you speak to God? Can you speak on behalf of God? We realize that for a lot of individuals that are sitting in churches, mosques, temples, spiritual teachings, meditation centers every day, they are looking for that connection. And for a lot of them, the leader in that community, the community identified leader, becomes a representative and a representation of the thoughts and the concepts of their higher power and God. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that any individual that's sitting in those communities are able to hear messages coming from the pulpit to the door, and we're talking the person that answers the phone, anybody who interfaces with the community, that their problems, their issues, their mental health challenges are not too big for God. And that comes through education and replacing misinformation. So there's a wonderful project that I'm involved in called Mental Health Friendly Communities, where we're building mental health friendly communities. It's part of the Cal Mesa Each Mind Matters campaign, where we're looking at, from a mental health standpoint, communities where there seems to be a great deal of disparities. The African American community, Native American community, Asian API community, and Latino and Hispanic community. And for the African American community, we've discovered that the only way to really get the message effectively across to the masses is to work with faith community leaders. So we do that by educating those faith community leaders about mental health, so that when they're speaking about mental health, when they're speaking about mental health challenges, they're doing it from a well-informed place, where they're not promoting stigma and discrimination toward individuals with mental health challenges, but rather they're welcoming them in a way that builds on their strengths and promotes wellness from within the community. So that we're talking individual wellness and then community wellness as well.
And if the pastor or the priest or the imam has a healthy congregation, he or she are thrilled.
Mm-hmm.
Were you raised in a God-fearing home? Your family go to church? And
Absolutely.
all of those things?
Absolutely.
Where was that?
I grew up in the Bay Area, in Oakland, California. I had a very close-knit family and community. In fact, my pastor was my neighbor. And great friend. My husband and my husband's father and my pastor were also really good friends. So we grew up where our church family was an extension of our biological family.
Were you a happy little girl?
I was a very happy little girl. I had a very happy childhood. I knew that my daddy loved me with all his heart, and he convinced me of that very early in a very unique way, because he did it without ever telling me until I was an adult. But I knew that my dad would stop the earth from spinning on its axis if he thought he could, and it would help me. And yet I also knew that I related a little bit differently, that I felt things a little bit differently than other people. And it took some time to learn that that was okay, but that when it became a disruption, that I was worth getting the help, because it's not all of who I am.
I read not too long ago, and I think it was Doris Kearns, but I'm not sure, who said that on the day a girl gets married, she's no longer married to her father. And that rang a bell. My wife had a wonderful father, and he was one who would have stopped the world from spinning if it needed to be. And yet one day, you know, you find your own man or woman and start off in your own life, and dad and mom are happy that that's happening and hope it'll work out.
Absolutely.
What do you think is the greatest stigma that attaches itself to us sort of in California as it relates to mental health? What's the great stigma?
Well, there are so many. I mean, you know, when you look at stigma, you're talking about the shame, the blame, the guilt, and we look at that internally, and then we also look at that externally. So it's not just the things that happens through, we're inundated with messages about mental health every day from the media, whether it's news or it's an inaccurate portrayal through TV programs, but we get this picture somehow that individuals who live with mental health concerns are violent, which is, you know, statistically not true. The fact is that most individuals who have a mental health diagnosis are more likely to be the victims of a violent crime than they are to be the perpetrator of the crime. So there's the media piece that just comes from outside. There's also the internal piece that I think a lot of times is perpetuated through what you see in media, because then it's what I feel about myself. If I admit this, how will I be treated? And then when we talk about stigma, it's very difficult when we start talking particularly for communities of color, where we do have to acknowledge that the stigma conversation comes a little bit later, because we do have to deal with discrimination and then stigma, because then there's the overwhelming discrimination through historical and institutional racism, and then there's this, on top of that, there's this layer around mental health and the stigma that comes along with that, that there's one more thing that I have to watch out for in being treated unfairly in society. So I think that it's all of the messages that we get from people sitting and talking and one another. I had a very interesting encounter just this week in a shopping center. I was with my son, who has been diagnosed with ADHD, and someone was talking to me and said, "Oh my goodness, you know, I'm just talking all over the place. So, you know, I guess I'm just ADHD," with no idea that you were actually talking to someone who lives with what ADHD actually looks like, and it doesn't actually always look like someone switching subjects. So we have to be very careful of how we see things as a society. There are a lot of groups that you can openly make tasteless jokes about, and it's okay. And I would say that for me, 3 come to mind, and I'm sure we can talk about many more, but 3 come to mind. You know, individuals who live with issues with their weight, individuals who are from the older adult community, and individuals from the mental health community. And you can make jokes and people will laugh and think nothing of it. And what's unfortunate, I believe, and I can just speak for myself, that, you know, I've been overweight, lost 100 pounds last year, but I've been overweight, so I've been on that side. I know what it's like to have people judge you just by how you look. I also have a mental health diagnosis, so I know what that feels like, to hear people, you know, just be dismissive about it and make these harsh statements. And I hope to be a part of the older adult population one day, but not quite yet.
You're looking good, by the way.
Thank you.
You know, jumping back to the discrimination and those kinds of things for a minute, we were talking earlier about how, you know, you may have grown up in a very black community. I have no way of knowing that. And I grew up in a very white community. But as it goes along with our children, and now particularly with our grandchildren, they're sort of colorblind, because there's a great mix of all the nations and the peoples, and the kids just want to be friends. And so if they get discrimination, they might be getting it from their parents, because they're not getting it just amongst their peers. I don't think the kids are just all thrilled. They don't care if they're blue or green or purple or gray. You know?
I think to a certain degree we all come in with that. I have to say, however, that I grew up in a very diverse community, very culturally diverse background. But I will say that we are seeing evidence that when you get to a certain age, you're not getting it from your parents. I would say that news, very recent news, has done a great job of showing us that the world is not colorblind. I think we can look at that very clearly with the Trayvon Martin case and George Zimmerman. It sent a very clear message to young African American men that, at least in some segments of society, by and large, they are considered less than. And so we see that we are having some campaigns and some things like that, Your Life Matters campaign, to help rebuild the self-esteem of a community. But that does affect a community quite a bit, particularly in communities where there's a lot of contention between law enforcement and the community. And so, you know, there are, it is not a colorblind society, I will say that. And our children are getting that message sooner and sooner through the schools, and not just in the home.
And hopefully 2 or 3 more generations down the road, we will so be blended in that some of that will fix itself. You know, I sat with 2 couples not too long ago, and the man said, well, she's in charge, and she's always been in charge, and we all know it. And the other woman, or the other couple, said, well, he's never let me have a word. You know, he told me when we first got married, he's the man, he's in charge here, all these other sorts of things. So then the 4 of them wanted to talk about, because they were sincerely looking for help, they wanted to talk about how they could get off their high horses and balance things and settle things a little bit, and they were people in their 50s. And about all I could come to was, well, it's good that at this age you're figuring all of this out. So I'm hopeful that a lot of these things will get figured out just with time, I hope.
And continuing to come together and talk about it. I think one of the most meaningful things that we could do is we can look at when we're coming to a table, who's at the table, and who are we really looking at, and how do we identify that that really is an individual that the community would identify as a cultural broker. Through our trainings, when we're training Mental Health 101 for faith leaders, we utilize cultural brokers, and those are individuals who can speak from the lens of not just faith community leader, but they also are well versed in mental health, also very well versed in issues that are prevalent in the ethnic communities. I think that we tend to look at diversity from community to community, but then we also have to look at the diversity that happens from within a community and make sure that all points of views are heard. And so I think that's a great example that you talk about with the couples, and that's exactly what we're doing with mental health and spirituality, is we're looking to see how the diversity is playing out in society, who we can bring to the table to have this very comfortable and open dialogue that respects where everybody is coming from. So instead of just sort of saying this is how it is, understanding that my point of view does not minimize the next point of view. And then how do we share space with one another?
Will most people who are battling some form of mental health, regardless of their age or gender, will they eventually make their way in a path toward God, or does that not necessarily matter?
You know, we've seen several different things, and that's why when we've seen this play out in several different ways. I think when we surveyed individuals and families living with mental health challenges throughout California, 79% said that spirituality and faith was essential to their mental health.
That's a pretty high number.
That's a very high number. When we started to drill down to ethnic-specific communities, those numbers got even higher.
Wow.
So, for instance, in the African American community, it's about 88% of individuals say that their faith and spirituality is important to them. Again, when we start to look beyond the definition and we allow people to self-define and to define spirituality and faith for themselves, we definitely see that there's something to be said about a person's heartfelt connection to believe in something beyond themselves. I'm not saying that's true for every individual, but for many, that is definitely the case. Could recovery happen without spirituality? I'll be honest, I don't know. I have not seen it so yet. It really does remain a very important and core part of a person's being, and in that holistic approach, it seems to work best.
Most of us started somewhere in our childhood with a belief in God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you sit and talk with groups, or, you know, and they've all come from somewhere, but God was in the center of that. Mm-hmm. I'm hopeful that children being born today aren't having parents who say there is no God and don't believe, and all those other sorts of things, because God is hope and enrichment and enlightenment and, you know, so many other good things. Where do you see yourself 10 years down the road from now?
Still doing this work, going
Plugging
strong,
away.
making sure that I'm talking to both the mental health and the faith community, and getting them together to talk to one another. I think that that's incredibly important. And although I focus a lot because of my lens of experience as a faith leader, and talk a lot about mental health with faith leaders, there is training that happens on the other side with the mental health clinicians and mental health services providers. And we do that. We work very closely with an individual who also serves on our steering committee statewide, Dr. David Lukoff, who's been doing this work for many, many years, looking at spirituality in mental health and how the two connect and really marry to make this wonderful partnership to serve the individual, which is the reason why we're all here, is to serve the individual living with mental health concerns. So I see myself continuing this conversation. As far as I think we'll always need to have the conversation. I think it evolves as time goes on, and we start to explore various topics as it results, as we, you know, move forward in our progression. But I definitely see myself still working to advocate for the fair and equitable treatment of individuals with mental health concerns.
Looking back 5 or 6 or 7 years, do you see quite a few changes from then, thus more changes coming, or is it sort of a
Absolutely.
routine?
Absolutely. I think when we started the statewide initiative in 2006, we had people who were saying, we're going to talk about mental health and spirituality. And you had a couple of different responses. You had people who sort of said, yes, yes, tell me more. I've been trying to have this conversation for a while. And then you had some people who kind of sat back and crossed their arms. And what we're seeing now is that those arm crossers are at least not doing it as much in public forums. There's a lot more openness to the conversation, and people are very much seeing that when you include spirituality and mental health recovery, you do see shorter recovery times, fewer relapses, and fewer hospitalizations. So Disability Rights now has another project looking at reducing stigma in faith-based communities. And so we're seeing all of these sort of movements that are happening across the state.
Do you have to find the churches, or are the faith leaders coming to you?
Both.
Both.
I mean, you know, both. We definitely are always actively looking for individuals where the faith leader is open to making a shift around wellness and recovery, and making sure that there's no stigma promoting activities going on in the church. But then we find a lot of faith leaders who have already been doing the work, and in a lot of cases been doing it very well. And so they're just looking for some technical assistance and some support, and we're doing that.
And you're there to do it.
We're there to do it.
Okay, if you could wave a magic wand to fix or change or repair or whatever, something in the world that would make us better, what would that be?
I would love the day when we can walk into places and people know what this green ribbon means, and that they know that it represents mental health awareness, and that we would stop looking at the diagnosis, but we would look at the entire individual, that every person would have a chance to be seen and to be heard.
I hope that will happen. Thanks so much for being here. It's always delightful to visit with you. And way to go.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.